Welcome to Battle of the Bands for a special encore episode featuring none other than the world's leading rock and metal journalist, Mick Wall. Mick has worked in the music industry for over 4 decades, and he's considered to be to music journalism what Keith Richards is to the guitar. Since cutting his teeth for rock magazine Sounds in 1976, Wall went on to work for the likes of Kerrang, Rolling Stone, Playboy, Mojo and Classic Rock magazine. And he has penned countless rock and roll biographies, including Enter Night, the Metallica biography. Mick lived through it all, and he knows both Metallica and Megadeth intimately. So who better to join us to cap off Season 1 of Battle of the Bands? Welcome to the Battle of the Bands, Mick.
Really pleased to be here, Steve.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. We've just concluded our Megadeth versus Metallica Battle of the Bands opening season, and it kicked off a bit of a Facebook war. We had Megadeth fans saying, yeah, Megadeth's better, Metallica fans saying Metallica's bigger, and then we had people channeling the old El Paso taco girl saying, well, why can't we just have both? And I know you've been watching these bands pretty much from day one.
Yeah.
You've dealt with Metallica. You basically wrote their 500-page biography, Enter Night, which came out about 2010 now. So who better to have on the show than someone like yourself, I thought.
I also I knew Dave from when Megadeth started. I knew all those guys from before they got really, really big, and then right through that process.
Yeah.
For me, it again, I would definitely take both. I always took both, but I suppose if you got to choose, then I would choose Metallica simply because I think over the course of their career, they've taken more risks. I think over the course of their career, they've done stuff which interests me more, even if it doesn't always work. Metallica have done lots of things which, I could care less. To me, musically, their best days are way behind them.
Yeah.
But I loved the movie. I personally really like St. Anger. Me and Lars, I think, are the only people on earth that really love that album.
Yeah, probably.
I thought it was a fantastic move they made. It was entirely challenging. It was meant to be. It was divisive. They knew that would happen.
You're actually a fan of Lulu as well, from what I understand.
For me, Lulu's a masterpiece. I remember being in a playback room. This was in the days when people were still paranoid that if they gave you a CD, remember those? Yeah. You'd pirate it and put it on the net like I give a shit, Anyway, we had to hand in our phones and we sat in this dark room and they played the whole thing. And when we came out, most of us went to the pub, and I was literally the only guy that was like, well, that was really interesting. The rest are like, that was the biggest pile of shit I've ever... They have betrayed the metal cause and blah, blah, blah. I'm all for betraying the metal cause. I try and betray the metal cause every opportunity I get. Yep. Because to me, there is no such thing. It's like saying you're afraid of the Loch Ness Monster. It doesn't exist. It just in people's minds, particularly young people, because young rock fans, they form allegiances. They do feel there's such a thing as betrayal or straying from the true path. Well, Metallica always strayed from the true path. That's what made them so interesting.
Yeah.
Sometimes to their detriment. I'm going to talk about Megadeth as well, by the way, but sometimes to their detriment. I remember the big sweat that And Justice for All caused because you couldn't hear the bass because it was such a swampy, dark kind of record. But then I remember all the controversy over the Black Album which followed, because oh, they've sold out. Oh, they've got a hit single. Oh no, they're using Bob Rock as a producer.
They're recording
And
ballads.
then I remember the enormous controversy over Load. Oh no, they've cut their
hair.
They've cut their hair.
They're wearing collared shirts
and makeup. You know. So that's why, for me, they would get my vote over Megadeth. Not because they've necessarily made better records. I think they've just made more interesting choices, braver choices. And that's not just the Megadeth. That's, you name it, Iron Maiden, Def Leppard, any Slayer, any contemporaries of Metallica. I don't think any have made the kind of brave and interesting choices they've made.
Some might say Megadeth tried to with, say, the Risk album, but it didn't pay off, so they went back to their roots.
Well, they did, but they did it because Metallica were doing stuff. So they're like, well, we need to do. I mean, even the title of the album, Risk. You know, I mean, they should have called it "Look at Us, Aren't We Brave?"
We're taking a risk. Yeah.
I mean, to me, that totally kind of missed the target. They should have called it something like True Metal, and then not done it. You know, and then not done True Metal. I mean, that's a silly idea, but it was such a conscious move to become to invade that space that Metallica had created, but at the same time not lose any fans. And to me, that's overthinking. That's overthinking. Metallica, from the word go, always had this other dimension. Like here in the UK, they would be featured in all the Music Weekly magazines that no other heavy metal band could ever get in those days. In the 80s, it was very marginalized, heavy metal in the UK. In America, you know, they would have features in the Village Voice in New York at a time when even the Rolling Stones are having trouble getting in there, you know, because it was too cool.
Yeah. One thing we touch on in the season, Mick, is hitting the #1 spot in the MTV weekly video playlist. And this was the mainstream playlist. And then after they'd played, I think it was the video for One of the Injustice for All album. And after the song came on, the announcer came back on and said, well, that was depressing. Here's Huey Lewis and the news.
Well, it was depressing, but whoever said great music shouldn't be depressing? Some of the music that means the most to me, whether it's rock artists or other forms of music, are those really deep, moving albums. Oh, it's too depressing. Well, of all the books you ever read, they all got to be happy and lovely people that you can relate to? Or do we like those dark, mysterious characters? Do we like people Breaking Bad? You know, do we want to see the dark side? Of course we do. I mean, that's where all the good stuff can be found. You know?
I think oftentimes, whether it's music or comedy or any sort of creative or artistic pursuit, it often comes from a place of pain, or at least the really good stuff does. You think of some comedians, the top comedians in the world, you reflect on where they've come from, and they've all had really difficult upbringings, broken homes, drugs, and all sorts of stuff going on. And that's usually the source for most of their best material.
Absolutely. I mean, the happiest, most content people tend not to want to express or shout. Or, I mean, most drummers I've met, there's a reason most drummers are mental. They like to hit things, you know, and they like to hit them in such a convincing way that everybody has to stop and watch them. I mean, that kind of feeds back into Lars. You know, I mean, Lars is the ultimate frontman drummer. You know, not since the Dave Clark 5 have we had a drummer want the camera on him so incessantly. I mean, even at shows, he spends most of the time standing up, you know, and shut up and sit. He can't even play that well. Shut up and sit down, you know. And he's always too fast in shows. He gets carried away. I mean, you know, this is this is someone with issues who wants attention. But Megadeth. Let me say about Megadeth. In the early days, Megadeth were the more interesting proposition.
Why do you say
because,
that?
Well, Metallica, and I knew them in those early days very well. And Lars actually had, bizarrely considering the path Metallica would eventually take, Lars had a fairly conformist idea of what a rock band should be, how it should evolve. He was a big Deep Purple fan. He wanted to be a big rock star. He wanted to do drum solos. Mm-hmm. You know, his hero as a drummer was Neil Peart from Rush, because he loved that, you know, all that stuff. It was really only Cliff Burton that kind of educated the other three. I mean, James was a Wookiee. But he was like, I tell you who he was like. He was like the lion in The Wizard of the Oz, the cowardly lion. That was James Hetfield. He even looked like the cowardly lion. Big guy, a lot of hair, complete wuss. Okay, boo, and he's frightened. You know, or get drunk and in a rage. You know, that kind of guy. Kirk was just a complete nerd. Lars was this over-entitled rich boy who everything had always gone right for. But Cliff was the smart guy. Cliff was the guy. I went out to see them when they were recording Master of Puppets in Copenhagen. And I was rifling through Cliff's, in those days, records. You know, you take your records and tapes on a road. And in there he had Kate Bush, Peter Gabriel, some Bach, Captain Beefheart. He also had some kick-ass metal records, but he was more into Leonard Skinner. You know, he was really
dressed that way as well. He had this whole southern rock sort of look and feel about him.
He did. He really did, and he liked to go fishing and he liked to shoot guns. So he was a really interesting combination of things, but also classically trained. I mean, the man could read classical music. He knew about counterpoint and all kinds of stuff. And he was awesome. But he was also an awesome dude, and he was the leader of the band, 100%. I mean, they moved to San Francisco to be with Cliff.
Yeah. I mean, just on Cliff Burton, I mean, a lot of Metallica fans say, oh, if Cliff was around today, he would not stand for the path that Metallica's taken. But based on what you've told me there about Cliff having this sort of diverse taste in music, perhaps he would be on board with them taking these risks and experimenting.
No, very much so. I think what would have happened, which is I go into in the book, is that Lars is the one that wouldn't be in the band anymore. I mean, Cliff had been talking to the others about replacing Lars with Dave Lombardi from Slayer, who is an incredible drummer, was an incredible drummer. So there really is a sliding doors moment here where had Cliff not died, there definitely wouldn't have been a Justice for All.
Would that have been a good thing for the band, though? Because Lars has been like this commercial force driving them forward. Technically, but commercially, perhaps not so much a good thing if that did come to fruition.
Oh, no, absolutely. The reason Metallica are this enormously successful band is entirely to do with Lars Ulrich, because he comes from an enormously successful background. For him,
Dad was a world champion tennis player?
He was. I mean, Lars told me we used to be very close, and he used to talk about how he'd been around the world half a dozen times before he'd even left school, let alone formed Metallica. You know, Lars was the guy that flew to London so he could buy a new wave of British heavy metal records. Days before the internet. You had to go to a store, you know. He flew to London on his own with Dad's money and went and bought all these records, got in touch with Lemmy, I mean, I as a kid, I wouldn't have dreamed of trying to get in touch with my favourite bands because A, I wouldn't have known how, and B, I probably wouldn't have had the train fare to get wherever they were. But, you know, when you come from his kind of, man grew up in a castle, you know, I mean, when you come from that kind of background, all things are doable, all things are you can accomplish. And also Lars was really smart. His father was also a jazz musician. Don Cherry was always hanging around, was Lars's godfather. You know, Lars had a great appreciation of art, film, culture, all this stuff going on. And this drive, this incredible drive. And it was Lars that pushed for the deal with Megaforce. It was Lars that pushed to leave Megaforce and go to Q Prime, which was Peter Mensch and Cliff Bernstein, who got them a major deal. This was Lars at every step of the way. It would have been Lars that pushed for the connection with Lou Reed, Lars that pushed for the haircuts and makeup. You know, Lars was hanging out on the road out of his own pocket with Oasis on their first album. I mean, it was bizarre. I went to see Oasis play some small theatre in London in like 94, I want to say.
Yeah.
And Lars was there. And I'm like, what the fuck are you doing here? Oh, man, Liam's cool. Yeah, no, yeah. I'm like, I can't believe this guy, you know.
It's too funny. So, you mentioned Cliff Bernstein, Mick, and he was quoted as saying that, you know, he's obviously Metallica's legendary manager alongside Phil Mensch and
Peter Mensch,
rather, and they also managed Def Leppard back in the early 80s.
Well, Peter started at Lieber Krebs, where he was the accounts manager for AC/DC, Ted Nugent, Scorpions, and Cliff worked with Mercury Records. But they formed together, and Def Leppard, Metallica, Queensryche.
Yeah, so something Cliff Bernstein has said about bands during the early days is that they're only as strong as their weakest link. So, I mean, looking at Metallica during the early days, obviously they made that famous decision to get rid of Dave Mustaine. Do you think he was their weakest link at the time? And obviously, in retrospect now, you could say hindsight's a wonderful thing. They made the right decision because look at Metallica today, one of the most profitable bands of all time, sold the third most number of albums than any other artist of all time. Like, it's insane what they've achieved, like 140 odd million album sales, should I say, not 140 units. So do you think that Dave Mustaine was their weakest link?
Not really. I mean, musically at that point, I think their weakest link was probably James. They were still talking about getting in a proper frontman.
Yeah.
He was a rhythm guitarist. Mustaine, far more talented musician, could actually sing. I mean, Hetfield went on to have a fantastic persona, wonderful frontman, but I'm talking before they've made a record. The reason Mustaine had to go was he was just a giant asshole. You know, I mean, that was he was a pain in the ass. How to lose friends and alienate people. You know, that was Dave Mustaine.
Yeah.
At a time in a band's journey where it's all about making connections, it's all about getting people to help you out. Again, no social media. This is all about face-to-face and on the phone. And you need every friend you can get, particularly when, you know, you're Metallica. You're not a young Bon Jovi that everybody gets in 2 seconds.
Yeah. I understand, like in those early days, Dave Mustaine would basically be shitting on other bands that they were playing alongside, whether it was a support band or a band that they were supporting themselves. He would just be saying, oh, you suck, and just giving crap to guitarists from other bands. And, you know, like you said, you're supposed to be forging these connections, not burning bridges.
Well, he was also doing it to his own band. I mean, Mustaine was still doing it to Megadeth for years and years after they formed. I mean, the guy was a karate black belt. He was also an alcoholic junkie. And he was also this amazing looking, incredibly talented very self-assured guy who just would kick your fucking ass if you got too much in his face. He's young and he's bad. He's a badass. I mean, he really is. And
I remember you wrote something for Metal Hammer about him being like the last kind of really hardcore rocker. Like you mentioned Lemmy, but Lemmy was always a gentleman, whereas Dave Mustaine was just this, you know, he had this snarl about him, take no prisoners attitude, and him being one of those last rock gods of that ilk.
Absolutely. He was real. I mean, one of the great things about Dave was he was 100% himself. And that's always a really hard thing to be. Even if you're the most reasonable guy in the world, you're going to bump up against that person sooner or later because their way is always the best way as far as they're concerned. But Mustaine wasn't reasonable. You know, Mustaine's personality was like his guitar playing. I mean, wild. This is wild fire, you know. And they just couldn't take him. He just was, you know, for all that kind of Metallica, we dress in black and we're bad and we're going to kick your ass. No. I mean, they were, you know, they just didn't need this guy around. He was just too fucking much.
Yeah.
So Mustaine is kicked out, says pure revenge fantasy. Right, I'll get my own Metallica together and out Metallica you. And I think he did for a couple of albums. I mean, for me, the first couple of Metallica albums, they're okay. You know, I think we look at them now through that prism of this was the beginning of Metallica, you know. But apart from Creeping Death, I mean, you can make an argument.
Black.
Yeah, okay, Fade to Black, yeah, Four Horsemen. You can definitely go through this. But I love Killing is my business and business is good. I mean, come on, you know.
Yeah, except for the album cover. It was...
Well, there are many terrible metal album covers from those days.
That was one of the worst ones. But I remember you wrote something in Kerrang. I think it was about Master of Puppets, and you wrote at the time that it would be better than anything Metallica's so-called peers would release that year. But then came along Raining Blood from Slayer and Peace Sells from Megadeth. Now, do you still stand by that comment, or?
Of course I do. Of course I do. You have to remember, Master of Puppets came out in like March, and I would have had my copy in February. I'd also been in the studio with them while they were making it, getting completely fucked up on elephant beer, which is this Danish beer that will kill you. Elephant beer, cocaine, and obviously whiskey. And the snow was like 6 foot deep. I mean, I can remember us having sort of play snow fights out of our brains at 2 a.m. So obviously I'd built up, plus I'm still a young guy. I mean, I think I was, how old was I? Maybe 27 when that album came out. So I'm having the time of my life. And also they'd come into the office. We knew these guys, you know, I knew Lars. Again, only a rich boy from a very kind where success is the norm. He just turned up at the Kerrang magazine office one day and just hung out for like 3 days. So, you're kind of like, wow, this is unusual. I mean, a couple of years later, Guns N' Roses would do the same. But by then it was more normal for groups to come into the office. Lars was one of the first just to pile in. Hi, I'm I run the American fan club for Motorhead. When Motorhead only had like 2 fans in America, you know. So I had this relationship already, and I did actually and still do feel that Master of Puppets was the first inclination I had that Metallica would not be just another heavy metal band. And fantastic as Rain in Blood is, what's the other one you mentioned?
Peace Sells from Megadeth.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Peace. I mean, that track.
Yeah.
But if you listen to Master of Puppets and you listen to Orion, if you listen to Damage Inc., the title track, but also I want to say textures. There was a incredible light and shade, and a lot of it was very percussive, a lot of it was very kind of discursive. And I think if you want to talk about pure metal, for sure Slayer. If you want to talk about a pure classic anthem, absolutely Peace Sells. I mean, that's just, you know, there's you cannot argue.
Pay my bills.
Absolutely, great lyrics. But I think as an overall musical statement, I would still go with Master of Puppets, and I would still go with my assertion at the time that actually there is something here that is not what you're going to find with these other bands. And I think that has been borne out as the years have gone by, for sure. Metallica to me, are like, in terms of heavy metal, are like that guy at the end of Stanley Kubrick's movie 2001, you know, where he's just flashing through dimensions, and some of it's terrifying and some of it's hideous, but some of it is like you would never have got there if you hadn't done all that other stuff. And I think that's kind of where Metallica, I don't know about now, I think they've retreated from, I think the Lutalica album burned them. I think they've now got scared again, and they'll but it won't last. They can't help themselves. They really do need to explore outer space. Whereas I think Megadeth and Slayer, they kind of colonized it. You know, they kind of planted their flag, and here we shall remain. We've taken this planet, and now we own it, and you can challenge us, but you will never take it. And I don't think that's who Metallica is, and I think that's a source of frustration for a lot of their hardcore fans. But for someone like me, that's what makes them really, really interesting. But I do want to tell you more about Megadeth, because in the 80s in particular, 80s and early 90s, they, because of Mustaine, purely because of Mustaine, they had something going which did make them very distinct and unique. And it was this authenticity about Mustaine. He absolutely was his own worst enemy. But then so was Jim Morrison, so was Bon Scott, you know, so were so many greats. The miracle is that Mustaine didn't die. When I was going over to LA very frequently, and then I just stayed for a while, and I got to know Dave. This is 88, 89 into the early 90s, and I got to know Dave pretty well. And he had this very, very severe heroin problem. I mean, he would take and do anything, but heroin had become, as it does always with people, it become the one thing he was really messed up on. And he went into rehab. I
was like then 14 times or something.
Ridiculous. I mean, there was one time he went in and he called everybody, including me, to come and he wanted me to turn up in a cab. And he would climb over the wall and get into the cab. And I just, you know, I just said, I can't do that. I can't do that. I mean, more than anything in those days, I just imagine his managers or record label beating down my door and causing all kinds of scenes. So I just couldn't do that. But someone did. You know, people did do things like that for him. But then eventually, come the time of Rust in Peace, it connected for him. He got clean, he got sober, he became born again. I remember we had a really long lunch at some Thai food place, and in those days, I mean, I had beer for breakfast, you know, I mean, but we're having mineral water.
Breakfast of champions, Mick.
Absolutely. And I remember being a bit put out because I didn't feel I could drink, because obviously he's super clean. These days, I mean, you know, but back then it was, you know, people still smoked and drank, and I can't smoke, fuck you, you know, how dare you, get me gun, you know, but he made me laugh so much. He was a super funny guy. And he told me he got into, he'd started with bungee jumping and hang gliding, but now he got into parachuting. He was like, you gotta come parachuting. I'm like, no,
mate.
fucking no way, mate. No way. I'm going to parachute out of this restaurant and get me a drink in a minute is what I'm going to do. So, but he also, because the other thing about Mustaine, I said he was a black belt in karate, alcoholic junkie, amazing guitarist, great singer and writer. But he also, had dabbled with magic. I mean, not conjuring tricks, but actual spells. Mm-hmm. And I remember talking to him about this over lunch. And he went into it. I know something about it, but he went into it in a way which I thought, oh God, he actually does. So we were talking this stuff, and we were talking about hexes, and he told me about the sex hex, because that was the other thing about Mustaine. He fucked for America, Did you ever see that that show Silicon Valley? Have you ever seen Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I've seen a few episodes. Yeah.
There's one episode in like the second or third season where this new investor comes in, and of course he's mental. He's a billionaire and he's mental, and all his cars have doors that open like that, And he comes in, and the least likely person in the room, this guy Jared, who's this real kind of geek, he looks at me, and he goes, "This guy fucks. We know he does. This guy fucks." He's like the least guy that would ever. But it turns out later he was right.
Yep.
Mustaine was the guy that fucks. And he would fuck your wife, your mother, your sister, your crippled auntie. He didn't give a fuck. Right?
Tell us about the sex hex and his application.
Well, this is where we're going. So he told me about a sex hex, which you would do, and it meant that the woman you did it on would absolutely have to come and make sweet love to you. Let's put it like that. And I'm like, what do you need a sex hex for? He said, no, man, this is like when I was 16. I said, you were doing sex hexes at 16? He went, sure. Turns out his sister was a white witch, and she'd taught him this stuff. So anyway, I won't go into all the details, but he a bit of paper, he draws it all out. He shows me what you need to do and all the things you need to do. And I went, okay, I'm thinking, I'm going to try this, And then just as we were leaving, he said to me, don't try that out on Princess Di. And I laughed. But then afterwards I thought about it, and I thought, actually, he's got a point, hasn't he? Maybe doing a sex hex on someone. Don't forget, this is decades before Me Too, and this is LA metal, okay? And I'm thinking, actually, he's right. You really wouldn't want to do that. That would be an awful thing to do. But also think of the consequences, not just for the poor girl, but for yourself. I mean, next thing, her boyfriend or her best friend or the police or, and if it had been Princess Di, then, I'd have been in that car as well, wouldn't I, when she went under the tunnel? I mean, but I kept that bit of paper in my wallet for years. I never, ever did try it because I was so convinced it would work.
Yeah.
Hexes do work if you do them properly, but they always have a consequence. And this is my point, really, which is Mustaine struck me because the purpose in doing magic is always to affect outcomes. So that's it. That's the only thing it's done for. And so I would be astonished, amazed, and in disbelief if someone tried to convince me that Mustaine had never, ever cast spells or rituals, put it that way, in order to help his music, his career. But these things always have consequences. And it's about balance. So the farther you push for, say, success, the darker the consequence will be for you. And it becomes a never-ending journey. You can't just do the one thing and go, well, that's me sorted. It's not like I've got 3 wishes and I'm cool. It never ends. It's like life. It never ends. And I think Mustaine's career has kind of been defined by his habit of doing, I'll say sex hex, but his habit of wanting to go right to the brink and then go further. And it has damaged him, and it has come back on him. And I think that big conversion he had in the early 90s, I mean, cut to a year or two after that, on the Countdown for Extinction tour, I happened to be in Honolulu for a different reason. And he was staying in the same hotel. They were doing a gig. And I went, oh, fuck, I'll come along. And I went there that night. And just before they went on, him and the band, did the big huddle.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just, the usual. They were praying. And then they went on. And it was a US air base in Honolulu. So it was packed full of testosterone crazy young soldiers with their shirts off, beating each other up to Megadeth. And they rose to the occasion. They were brutal. But at the same time, as soon as they got off, they said another prayer. And I think Mustaine, I love Mustaine. I take my hat off to him more than I do. I take my hat off to him in the same way that I did Cliff Burton. And the thought of Cliff and Dave, if Dave hadn't been so young and fucked up on drugs, I think the two of them could have made some really interesting music.
Yeah.
I don't think if Cliff had lived, I don't think Metallica would have come anywhere close to being as commercially successful as we know them now. But, Guns N' Roses sold more copies of their debut album, Appetite for Destruction, and this still is true. They sold more copies of that than Bob Dylan has sold in his entire career. Now, you ask me who's the more interesting artist, Guns N' Roses or Bob Dylan? There's no argument. It's Bob Dylan every single time. The Rolling Stones really never sold that many records. People assume they were titans because of their legend, because of the mythology. But really they were a singles band in the 60s. And by the time albums became the thing, they had great chart albums, number one albums in America, but they didn't sell millions and millions. Those weren't the days when those things really happened. So I don't measure 5 million, 500 million, whatever it is. That to me doesn't make you great.
Yep. If
you've done that and you're great, wow, fantastic. But that to me isn't a useful measure. So Metallica have outsold Megadeth. Metallica have outsold, as you say, pretty much everybody.
Pretty much everyone. Mm-hmm.
But they would have been a more interesting band if Cliff Burton hadn't died.
Yeah.
I mean, he loved the Police, as I said. He loved Peter Gabriel, Kate Bush, Pink Floyd. So conceivably, they could have become enormously successful. But it would have been in a musical form that I think would have been more interesting. Yeah. And I don't think it would have mattered if they'd become platinum-selling, festival headlining rock stars or not. Mustaine, round about the time of Rust in Peace, particularly Countdown for Extinction, I love that album. Still love that album. I was listening to Sweating Bullets the other day. And I just think, wow, he was onto something really, really good.
Yeah. So with Dave Mustaine, Mick, we talked earlier about contentment and how some artists, or how great art comes from a lack of contentment and from a crazy upbringing and perhaps having no plan B. Now, in the Some Kind of Monster documentary, there's this exchange between Lars and Dave, where Dave basically says, I had nothing, then I had everything when he joined Metallica, and then I had nothing again. And perhaps there's an argument to be made for his firing from Metallica giving him the fuel he needed to become the Dave Mustaine we know and love today. Whereas if he had stayed in the band, who knows? All we can do is hypothesize, but maybe he would have become complacent and never come up with the material that he did with Megadeth.
No, absolutely. I agree. Adversity, what do they say? Necessity is the mother of invention. Yeah. It was do or die. But he didn't die. He did go out and form his own band. Luck always plays a significant part in all our lives. So you can't rule out that. But, guts sometimes will take you further even than talent. You know, there are many rock bands we could name right now, I'm sure, that they don't have an enormous amount of actual talent, but they've got so much front, so much energy, such balls, such courage, really, and persistence, that they've had better careers than more talented musicians that just couldn't get out of the house.
Yeah.
Lot to be said for getting out of the house, you know. So I agree. I mean, you know, you could say, well, if Mustaine hadn't been such an enormous prick and they had to get rid of him, if that hadn't happened, well, maybe none of them would have been as successful. You know, maybe they'd have done one album and flamed out. Maybe everybody would have been so over them by the time they'd done that album and tour. They all hated them because of Mustaine. Or maybe if they'd become more like Mustaine, they would have all, you know, it was in the balance. It was in the balance. It really was. But yeah, I mean, Mustaine, loads of people have been fired from bands. You know, the history of music is full of groups that got rid of this guy and that guy early on. But they didn't all go on to form Megadeth. You know, they didn't all go on to make a truly historic metal band, rock band, whatever you want to call it, that we're still talking about today. I think really
years after their founding.
Yeah, we got lucky. I think the world got lucky. I think they got lucky. But luck, you know, you need luck. It is the special sauce. But it comes to you know, what is it? There's an expression, isn't it? Yeah, the harder I worked, the luckier I got, you know.
Yeah, well, what is it? Luck is the intersection of opportunity and preparedness.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. I mean, I could have been fired from Metallica, but then I didn't look like Mustaine, play guitar like Mustaine, and come up with songs like Mustaine. So, you know, these guys were ready to go. They were good to go. But I think, in a way, it was fantastic that they did split because look at what, you know, look at the fruit that they bestowed us with. Some of it
exactly
poison,
right.
but most of it fantastic.
Yeah. So bringing it full circle back to the start of the conversation, you know, why can't we have both? I think we can, and we have, and I love both bands, and I think, like you said, let's just enjoy the material of both Megadeth and Metallica. So thank you so much, Mick. This has been a great conversation. Of course, people can learn more about your work over at your Facebook page, the Mick Wall Facebook page, and of course, pick up a copy of Enter Night, your 504-page Metallica biography. But also, before we wrap up, you're joining us here at No Filter Media to host a podcast of your own called Get Your Rocks Off. What can you tell us about that?
Get your rocks off.
Get your rocks off.
Get your rocks off. Well, I don't like to do too much pre-planning. Having said that, the way I always talk about it is I don't sit with this podcast. I'm not going to sit down and come up with a list of ideas. I'm just going to do them because it's not like I'm coming in with nothing. You know, I was first published as a music writer back in 1977. I've written a gazillion books. I've done a gazillion TV and radio shows, live appearances. I've been round the world a zillion times with every major band you can think of. And I have some stories to tell. And that's what Get Your Rocks Off is going to be about. It's going to be about stories. If anybody has any ideas for the sort of podcasts or subjects they'd like me to discuss, they can send them in and we'll certainly have a look at that. But I'm going to bring in some buddies, some music writing buddies or people in the business, maybe some rock star buddies, definitely some rock star buddies.
Definitely.
It'll become a little easier as this whole...
Maybe once the lockdown kind of goes away and we get back to some semblance of normality.
Absolutely. Everywhere I go, I'll be bringing the laptop and the microphones with me. So it's going to be different every time, but it's going to be stories and it's going to be the truth. And it's going to be those stories that I couldn't put into print. So get your rocks off. Join me.
I look forward to listening to these stories, and people can subscribe over at nofilter.media/get your rocks off. Mick Wall, you're a gentleman and a scholar. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Steve.
This has been a No Filter Media production.
Say what you want.